I don't know if this is going to make me sound bad or not, but the truth is most weeks, once it's Monday or Tuesday, I can't remember what I preached the Sunday before. That's the way my poor little pea brain is. But interestingly, I can remember exactly the week that I preached this passage for the first time in my life. And it was about 20 years ago. The kids were little. The reason I remember it so distinctly is a few days before Sunday, and I knew I was going to preach on this, something happened to me that is stuck in my mind. Now, the church where we were at the time, there was a Mexican food restaurant just down the street. And while we were there, it changed hands at least 4 times. So it was always something different, something new, but it was always Mexican food because we're in Texas. But one time when it was something new, we decided to go visit and try it out. And within 5 minutes, our waitress, who was probably about 18 years old, had already dumped an entire glass of ice water right in my lap. She was very apologetic, and I was wide awake at that point. And so I told her it was okay, it's all right. But secretly what I was thinking was, well, this could turn out for the good because I'll probably get my entree taken off the bill or get some free dessert or something like that. Always look on the bright side. The glass is half full. Actually, it was empty at that time, but you know what I mean. But the meal was over, and she brought out the check, and there was nothing taken off. There was no free dessert, nothing. I thought, well, that's not really the way I would have done things, but oh well, it's the way it goes. And I handed her my credit card, and as I did, I said, by the way, if you see that church down the street, that's where we go, and I'm actually the pastor, and we'd love to have you there if you don't have a church home. And she said, and I quote, "Oh, that's okay, because I'm already really religious. In fact, I've already decided that I told a lie this last week, and that's why that happened a minute ago." And I said, well, and I didn't say anything, but I'm thinking, that's some odd theology. You sinned, and I got punished. I don't understand. I don't think that's how God works, but I didn't say anything. We got in the car, and as we're driving away, little Kaylee, who's probably 7 at the time, she goes, "Oh, the food was so good there. I hope we come back." And I said, maybe takeout, maybe we'll get it to go. But I tell you that story, and again, such an interesting week for that to happen, because often in this world, and you know this, without ever doing anything to deserve it, sometimes somebody just dumps on you. Somebody just hits you with everything they got. Now, in that case, it was an accident, and sometimes it will be for us too. Someone won't mean to hurt your feelings. Someone won't mean to inconvenience you, won't mean to slam into your car. But other times it's pure meanness. Other times it's just somebody just doesn't like you for whatever reason, for no good reason, and you're in their crosshairs, and you take the full brunt of what they have. Now, there is a way that we tend to respond from birth. It is ingrained in us from birth. It is in our flesh. It is endorsed by and incentivized by the world. And the world's response is stand up for yourself, stand up for your rights, don't take any disrespect. In that case, people would have told me, you need to talk to that waitress's manager. You need to make sure that he or she knows what was done to you. You'll get a little visceral satisfaction from watching her get chewed out in front of you, if not fired, and you'll probably get some kind of reparations. They would have said, if you feel insulted, then you make sure that they pay for the insult. If somebody hurts you, you hit them harder. If you feel cheated or wrong, you find an attorney and sue them back into the Stone Age. You make sure you win. You never play the victim. You always win. And in the words of Machiavelli, it is better to be feared than to be loved. Now, there is a name that I have for that principle by which we live life. And I'm going to tell you that name in a little while, because what Jesus is going to hit us with is a very different principle. A principle that will set us at odds with the rest of the world, that will make us a different people, a distinct people. You might even say salt and light in a tasteless and dark world. This is the part of the Sermon on the Mount that we're about to read, which if you're with Jesus so far, and if you're able to say amen so far, this is the point at which Christians usually get there and go, okay, I'm done. I can't do this. But you can. Jesus gives us the power by his resurrection power to live out a different kind of life. This is the life he's called us to live. He would not call us to it if he would not also equip us to do it. The question is, do you want to live this way? And in fact, what I believe is not only is this a way that is more glorifying to him, a way that draws people to him like light draws people stumbling in the darkness, it's actually a better way. A better way of living, a way that leads to our joy, our peace, our flourishing as human beings, abundant living. So let's read this different way that Jesus has in mind. Verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So Jesus starts this section of teaching by quoting from the law of Moses, as he's been doing all throughout Matthew chapter 5. Exodus 21:24 is his first quotation. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That was the law of Moses. The scholars call it the lex talionis, which is a great term. It's in Latin. It means the law of retaliation. But the interesting thing about the lex talionis is it was meant to do the opposite of what we make it do. Let me explain what I mean by that. God gave this law, yes, to punish evil, but also to limit vengeance. Because in the ancient world, there was no such thing as a police force. There was no such thing as organized law enforcement. So people were responsible for making their own justice. And so you can imagine what tended to happen, both in Israel and in other countries all around the world. If you thought that I stole one of your sheep, you would come back with some of your clansmen and you would steal all my cattle. And then I would come back with all my clansmen and I would burn down your village. And back and forth it would go until everyone was dead or dying or hurt. And there would be long-standing feuds that would tear communities, families, nations apart. God said, no, from now on, the punishment should fit the crime. If I bonk you in the nose, you don't get to hit me over the head with a board and give me a concussion. You go to the town leaders and you say, this is what happened to me. He stole my sheep. He punched me in the eye. He insulted my daughter. And the town leaders say, okay, the punishment will fit the crime. Your punishment for stealing a sheep is different than it would be if you'd committed cold-blooded murder. That's the lex talionis. That was the intent, was let's limit retribution. Let's make sure the punishment fits the crime. And ironically, we've taken the law that God created to limit vengeance and we've used it to justify vengeance. So you hear people say sometimes, that guy cut me off in traffic. Well, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I'm going to run him off the road. That person gossiped about me. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I know some things about him. I'm going to spread it all around our office. And so we've taken what God meant to limit personal vengeance and we've used it to justify vengeance. Or to take Jesus' second example, verse 43, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. You've heard, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. Now, love your neighbor is Leviticus 19, verse 18. But nowhere in the law of Moses does it say, hate your enemy. So what is Jesus quoting there? He is quoting the way people tended to apply love your neighbor. So let me explain what I mean by that. It's hard for us to understand because we live in a country that is free, that is prosperous, that is powerful. We are blessed in so many ways. We don't worry about invasion from outside. But if you're a Jew, you're part of a people who virtually since the beginning of their people, has been surrounded by enemies. And man, you got to give it to the Jews. They are so resourceful and so courageous and so strong, and they've fought and they've survived so many different empires that have sought to wipe them out. And yet it would have to get old. Even today, when Israelis live in a nation that is free and that is prosperous, they're still surrounded by enemies. And so if you're a Jew, you grow up thinking, okay, in order for me to really love my neighbor and be a good Jew, then I need to hate the Gentiles. Because if I'm friendly with the Gentiles, that's showing weakness and that's showing vulnerability, and they might take advantage of that, and I might be the weak link in our nation that causes invasion, that causes persecution, that causes the downfall of my people. I need to be strong. I need to stand up to the enemy. And Jesus is saying, no. You see, you can't take a command created by God to call us to love everyone around us and use it for the opposite. In fact, that's why Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. He told it as if to say, listen, it's not blood, it's not nationality, it's not race. It's if that person is on the earth with you, you're called to love them. Now, why would we do this? Why would we take God's clear commandments and do the opposite with them? Besides the fact that we're just sinners by nature, it's because of that sin, we live by a principle. And this is the principle I talked about at the very beginning. And I'm going to give it a name. I call it the principle of personal justice, which says life may not be fair for everyone, but I'll make sure it is for me. There's lots of people out there that get the fuzzy end of the popsicle stick, right? There's lots of people out there that are the Charlie Browns of our world that always lose out. I'm not going to be one of those. I'm going to make sure I win every confrontation. I'm going to make sure I stand up for myself and my rights, and no one's going to take advantage of me. In reality, we think that's strength. That's what the world calls strength, but it's actually weakness. It's actually a very fear-based way to live. Remember when we were little kids? Everybody, when you're an adult, you think, oh, to be a kid again, to be carefree. Being a kid is one of the scariest times of your life because there's all the bullies on the playground. You think, I can't show weakness. I got to beat up this kid that's smaller than me so everybody thinks I'm tough. If everybody's making fun of the one kid that's a little awkward, I need to make fun of him too, because that way they won't be making fun of me. There's a very much of a law of the jungle aspect to childhood, if you recall. And if you don't recall, you've forgotten, because it's true. And we're just big, hairy 5-year-olds. And we want our chicken nuggies and our ice cream, and we don't want to have to eat any broccoli. And we want your toys as well as my toys. And if you pull my hair, I'm going to bonk you in the nose. And that's the way we live. It's the law of personal justice. And it's the reason why there are wars today. It's the reason why families break up. It's the reason why friendships don't last and communities are divided. It's the root of so many of our issues. The law of personal justice, the principle of personal justice. Jesus is calling us to a different principle, and I call it the principle of love. The principle of love says the best way to live is by putting the needs of others first. You might say, it's impossible for me to love everybody. There's people that I can't stand. Jesus didn't say you have to look at that person and say, aren't they adorable? Because there are people that are just going to rub you the wrong way. And there are people who, because of what they've done to you, you will never get to the point where you like that person, but you choose to advance their good. You will the good for them. You pray for good to happen to them. You intentionally behave with kindness toward them. You refuse to run them down behind their back. You choose at all times to treat them the way you would want to be treated. And some say that is so unrealistic. Nobody can live that way. But I've seen it. I remember one of the first times I was struck by this. I was in seminary, and so I was in my early 20s. In fact, I was in a youth ministry class in seminary. We had to take one youth ministry class as part of my degree plan. And so all these guys, all of us were 23, 24 years old. There was one guy in the class that was in his mid-40s, so 20 years older than us. And one day, every day we took prayer requests and prayed before we started class. And on this day, the older man in our class I'm young. I'm older than him now, so it's funny to call him that. But he said, I have a prayer request. He said, there's this young man, and he gave his name. He said, this guy was dating my daughter. My wife and I knew he wasn't a good person, wasn't good for our daughter, and so we made them break up, but he wouldn't accept it. And so for the last month, he's been basically following her around all day at school. Every time she turns around, he's standing there. At night, we see him driving past our house real slow with the stereo turned up real loud, so we'll hear him. And it's just really scaring my daughter, and it's been making me angry. And last night, he just pulled up in front of our house and just sat there. And he said, I was on my way out the door to just take him apart. Now, every one of the rest of us, none of the rest of us had teenage kids. Only a handful had kids, period. And yet all of us were sitting there going, yeah, take him apart. I remember my own fists were clenched. I didn't have any kids at all, but I'm like, yeah, let's see some vengeance. I want this guy to get his pound of flesh. But he said, as my hand was on the door, the Lord spoke to me and said, that's not what I've called you to do. He said, I walked out to that door, not knowing what I was going to do. I walked out to that car, and to my surprise, he didn't drive away. I knocked on the window, and he unlocked the door, and I sat down beside him. And I sat there for an hour, and I shared the gospel with him, and he accepted Christ. He said, my prayer request is that this young man would live out his faith, would get baptized, and would become a man of God. And we were just blown away. That's not the way we thought that story would go. That's not the way the story goes when we tell that kind of story, right? And yet that's what God has called us to. The principle of love. The principle of, I'm going to will the good for this person. They may not accept it. They may respond by spitting in my face. They may respond by rejecting entirely the love that I offer. And yet I'm going to do what Christ has called me to do. There's another way to put this, okay? If you don't like that term, the principle of love, here it is. In a world where everybody has thin skin and a hard heart, where we take offense at the slightest insult or at the littlest, the smallest disagreement, and we blow it up into something big, where our hearts are hardened and we refuse to show compassion, we refuse to show weakness, we refuse to show vulnerability at all. In a world where everyone has thin skin and a hard heart, Christ is calling us to thick skin and a soft heart. And you want to talk about strength. You talk about someone who's got a hide like a rhinoceros, and insults just roll right off of them. And they're so impossible to offend. And yet, when they see someone struggling, when they see the hurts, even of someone who's not likable, they are there in a heartbeat to offer help, to pray, to comfort, to weep alongside those who weep. That's strength. That's what Christ has called us to. And there are examples that he gives in the rest of this passage. First of all, he says, turn the other cheek. And that's a famous statement, and it's misunderstood by a lot of folks. I need to say something real quick. I need to clarify, because there are branches of the Christian faith which I respect for their consistency, but which I disagree with, who interpret this passage to mean that Christians should be pacifists. A Christian should never engage in any physical violence. They would say there shouldn't be police forces. There shouldn't be armed forces, that we should be people of peace. And the reason why I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about here is threefold. Number one, we see in the scriptures many, many times God commanding his people to fight. He commanded the armies of Israel to defend their borders, even to take the promised land. Romans 13, if you want to bring it into the New Testament, Romans 13 says it is the king's job, the government's job, to bear the sword for our good, to punish wickedness, to uphold righteousness. That's why a Christian in good conscience can serve in the military, can serve in law enforcement. Now, as Christians in the military, in law enforcement, you're called to continue to maintain integrity. And sometimes you have to say, okay, this use of force is not justified, but we are still called to keep our community safe. The second reason I don't think this is about pacifism, the apostles and Jesus himself, the apostles did not willingly allow themselves to be injured. Now, many times the apostles faced persecution. Jesus himself faced persecution. But you never see the apostle Paul go out into the street and say, I know my enemies are here. Pick up the rocks. Go ahead and stone me. In fact, we see Paul when the Romans have him and they've stretched him out on the rack and they're getting ready to flog him. He says, do you realize that I'm a Roman citizen, so what you're about to do is illegal? Which just shows it is good, it is right for us to defend ourselves, to free ourselves from harm. The only time an individual Christian, an individual in the Word of God, intentionally allowed himself, walked into danger and allowed himself to be killed was Jesus. And he did that one time, and it was for our redemption. And the third reason is when Jesus says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek. Why does he designate which cheek? He's making a point. Most of the population is right-handed. So the only way for a right-handed person to hit you on the right cheek is to slap you with the back of their hand. Now, I don't have a lot of experience in fist fighting. Last time I was in a real fight, and it wasn't really much of a fight. I was 12 years old. So I don't have a lot of experience with this. I do know this, though. If you're going to slap somebody with the back of your hand, that's not a way to win a fight. That's a way to start a fight. What Jesus is talking about here is not injury. He's talking about insult. He's saying if someone insults you, someone humiliates you in public, someone hurts your feelings, makes you angry, you take it. You have a hide like a rhinoceros. You have thick skin. You let it roll off of you the way I always did. Respond with love. Think about the impression that makes. In fact, in our own country, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was led by passages exactly like this. And that's why our nation changed its laws regarding race without violence, without rioting, without death and destruction, but instead with peace. Because Christian people said, I'm going to take insults and I'm going to show the world a better way. Jesus goes on and says, if anyone would sue you, we talked about this earlier, same kind of example in chapter 5. The principle is when you have a dispute with someone, God cares more about that other person than he does about the dispute between the two of you. It doesn't mean you always have to be the loser, but it does mean you should prioritize that person. You should love that person. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, Jesus says, this is reference to a real scenario in their society. Roman law stipulated that a Roman soldier could compel anybody to carry a burden for him for up to 1 mile, but no more. So, as we see today in our world, any place where there is an occupying force, that occupying force is hated by the people who live there. Talk to any of our troops who were stationed in Iraq or Afghanistan in recent times, and they'll tell you the hatred they had to put up with because of the people's attitude toward them. And in the same way that terrorists in Iraq and Afghanistan would set up IEDs to wound and to kill our troops, in the same way, there were zealots among the Jews who believed in acts of guerrilla warfare and assassination against Roman soldiers and Roman officials. Jesus said, don't be this way. Instead, go the extra mile. They want you to carry a burden for 1 mile. Well, you carry it too, just to show I'm not your enemy. I don't hate you. You are a child of God. I'm going to go further than you tell me. In fact, that term, go the extra mile, has entered our lexicon, our language. And then give to the one who begs from you. Jesus is not saying that we should always give every dollar we have to beggars, nor should we loan out money to everyone who asks. He's saying use the principle of love, not the principle of justice. Put yourself in the shoes of that person who needs your help. What do they need the most? If you were that person, what would you need the most? Sometimes giving a beggar $5 out of your pocket is not the right thing. You have to use wisdom and use discernment. But I'll tell you this, I would rather be taken advantage of by someone who plays on my sympathies than I would to get to heaven and realize that person actually was really needy and I didn't help. Be guided by the principle of love. After all, that's how God treated us and continues to treat us. That's how God is toward us. And that is how we will stand out as salt and light. We often talk about how Christians should love their families. That's a big emphasis for us. And yet every non-Christian I know, atheists, Muslims, other religions, they all love their families too. We talk about, well, what makes us distinct is you come into our house and look at the love and the warmth in this church body. And yet some of you have been on athletic teams and you've experienced the same thing. Some of you have been in the military. You've experienced that same camaraderie. Some folks will say, I experienced that at my local bar. Or there's even people on street gangs that will die for one another. So that doesn't set us apart. What sets us apart is when we choose to love the unlovely. When we choose to love people who don't love us back, when we respond to insults with kindness, to hatred with concern, to wounds with sincere prayer. It's thick skin and a soft heart. That is our goal. That is who we should become. At a certain university, there was a chemical engineer who had left behind his lucrative career to become a teacher, a professor, to give to the next generation. And his first class he ever taught was a freshman level chemistry class. And about halfway through the semester, his students all came to him and said, Professor, none of us are passing this class. The few that are making D's. This is just too hard. And he says, well, that's the real world. I really want to teach you chemistry. I want to make sure we're putting out people who are equipped. And they said, yeah, but half of us are going to fail. Can't you do something? He said, well, okay, let's see. I'll grade on a curve from now on. And so he went back and he changed the D's to A's and the F's to B's, and everybody was happy. And he continued to teach and offer these tests every couple of weeks to let them know how they were doing. And at the end of the semester, the students said, well, you're not going to give us a final, are you? Because, it doesn't really matter. We've learned our subject. He said, no, we need a final exam because then we'll know for sure what you know, how much you know about chemistry. And they said, well, then why don't you tell us ahead of time the questions that are going to be on the test so that we can pass? And he said, well, that's not the way the world works. You just encounter problems unexpectedly, so I can't do that. And they got angry. The students began to protest. They said, what you're proposing is not fair. And he said, oh, you want fairness? And they said, yes, we want fairness. And he said, you want justice? And they said, we demand justice. And he said, okay, then all the B's become F's and all the D's become A's. All the A's become D's. See, if you want justice, if you operate by the principle of personal justice, be careful what you wish for. Because judgment will begin with your house. If you want an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, don't be surprised if you wake up and everybody's blind and toothless. But if you want the life God chose for us, you'll embrace His grace. You'll embrace a God who laid down His life for us, who took our insults, who took our wounds, who took our suffering upon Himself. And all He asks in return is that you follow Him. We owe Him that same thing. We owe Him true obedience. This is the life that we're called to live. It is a good life. We have to vary from the world, and this is how.